Timelash, the joke story, the black sheep of Doctor Who and the one that gets ripped to shreds in almost every discussion about the show's low points. It's often considered one of the worst stories, and when you take into account the mighty 200 poll, where it ranked embarrassingly low, it's clear that most fans don't have much love for it. But here's the thing, Timelash could have been far better than people give it credit for. In fact, when you stop and really think about it, this story is literally a Dalek story in disguise. Don't believe me? Well, let's take a moment to actually think about it. Welcome to the Snake Pit, where we're full of bile and venom. I'm your host, Snake Daemon, and today we're diving into Timelash, a story that everyone laughs at, but maybe, just maybe, it deserves a second look. No, I'm not saying it's a hidden gem, nor am I about to claim it's some misunderstood masterpiece. But what I am saying is that when you break it down, this story has all the key ingredients of a Dalek episode, only stripped of the Daleks themselves. And the reason why? Well, that's where things get interesting. So let's lay it all out. The Borad, a disfigured, chair-bound dictator who only appears to his subjects via a monitor, speaking through proxies and controlling his people with an iron fist. Sound familiar? It should. The Borad is Davros in all but name. He sits in the shadows, issuing orders through his underlings, never getting his hands dirty himself. His isolation, his reliance on others to carry out his bidding, even his final fate, all of it feels like a Doctor versus Davros setup, except we're missing the usual megalomaniacal rant about exterminating all inferior life forms. But it doesn't stop there. Look at the androids that serve the Borad, mindless, unrelenting, devoid of individuality, operating with cold efficiency as they carry out their master's will. If that doesn't scream Daleks, I don't know what does. They might not be rolling tanks of death, but they serve the exact same function within the story. Nameless, faceless enforcers carrying out the will of their supreme leader. And then we have the Timelash itself, a swirling corridor of time used to dispose of enemies and unwanted individuals. Where have we seen that before? Oh, right. Resurrection of the Daleks, where Davros and the Daleks were utilizing a time corridor to manipulate history and eliminate their enemies. The only real difference here is that instead of being a tool for strategic warfare, it's being used as a glorified garbage chute for political dissidents. And speaking of Davros, let's not ignore the obvious dialogue lift that was poached for Remembrance of the Daleks. The Borad's last moments see him screaming, "You've tricked me," to which the Doctor smugly replies, "No, you tricked yourself." Now, where have we definitely heard that before? Oh yes, Remembrance of the Daleks. "Davros, you have tricked me!" The Doctor, "No, Davros, you tricked yourself." The line is almost identical, and while it wouldn't be the first time Doctor Who recycled its own dialogue, it makes you wonder if Timelash was originally going to feature actual Daleks before script changes forced it in another direction. Now here's the funny thing. I noticed these similarities years ago, long before I knew anything about Timelash's production history. When I was younger, I remember watching it and thinking this kind of feels like a Dalek story. But at the time, I just chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe it was just because Doctor Who had recurring themes, maybe it was just the way certain stories were structured. I didn't give it much thought and just assumed it was another run-of-the-mill misfire in the Doctor Who catalogue. It wasn't until later when I learned about the production history that everything suddenly made sense. This was a Dalek story. It had been written as a Dalek story. It had all the familiar elements, all the structure of a classic Doctor versus Daleks narrative, but then had those key pieces ripped out and hastily replaced. And looking back now, I can't unsee it. At the time, I just figured the Borad felt like Davros because Doctor Who had a thing for disfigured, power-hungry villains sitting in chairs. The androids felt like Daleks because Doctor Who often had mindless enforcers. The Timelash felt like the Dalek time corridor because Doctor Who reused a lot of its concepts, but the truth is, I was onto something without even realizing it. Now let's step back and consider the context. The truth is, this was supposed to be a Dalek story. Glenn McCoy originally submitted Timelash as a Dalek adventure, but it was rejected. However, rather than tossing it entirely, Eric Saward asked McCoy to resubmit the script without the Daleks, and that's where everything went wrong. So what do? You keep the skeleton of the story intact, but instead of Davros, you create the Borad. Instead of Daleks, you throw in generic androids. Instead of a time corridor used for tactical advantage, it becomes the Timelash. The result? A Dalek-light story that no longer feels as sharp or as menacing as it was probably intended to be. And that brings me to something else. The title. If Timelash had remained a Dalek story, this would have been one of the few times the Daleks weren't name-dropped in the title. Nearly every Doctor Who story featuring them makes it very clear they're involved. Genesis of the Daleks, Resurrection of the Daleks, Revelation of the Daleks, Remembrance of the Daleks. You get the idea. But here, the name Timelash gives nothing away. This could have been a fantastic opportunity to break the trend, delivering a real shock when the Daleks were revealed. And considering they rarely show up right away in their episodes, this could have been a brilliant way to build suspense before pulling the rug out from the audience. Instead, we got a villain that wants to be Davros, but just doesn't have the same presence. And honestly, that explains a lot. It explains why Timelash feels oddly structured, why the villain's motivations seem like they belong to a different kind of story, and why there's such an odd mix of elements that feel like they should work, but don't quite come together. It was a story that got reworked, repurposed, and ultimately it suffered for it. But hey, at least it had one saving grace. Paul Darrow as Tekker, who was clearly having the time of his life. He chews through every scene like he's been given an all-you-can-eat buffet, leaving nothing behind for anyone else. And honestly, good for him. If Timelash had nothing else going for it, at least it had that. So is Timelash some misunderstood classic? No, it's still a mess. The pacing is off, the production values are questionable at best, and Herbert Wells as a character feels like a joke that wasn't nearly as clever as they thought it was. But was it always meant to be this way? Absolutely not. The fact that this started as a Dalek story but was gutted into something else explains so much about why it feels disjointed. If it had remained a Dalek adventure, would it have been better received? Maybe, maybe not. But at the very least, it wouldn't feel like the awkward, misfit episode that it ended up becoming. And to think, I noticed this back when I was a kid, but never gave it much thought. Turns out my younger self was onto something after all. At least Big Finish haven't attempted to turn Herbert Wells into some recurring character like they have with other historical figures. As far as we know, the Doctor and Perry dropped him back off on Earth, and that was that. But given Big Finish's track record, I do wonder, could they be planning to revisit Timelash in a way that brings it closer to its original vision? They've done it before, reworking Revenge of the Cybermen and Ark in Space into their superior original drafts. Could they take Timelash and finally give us the Dalek story it was meant to be? Now that would be worth listening to. Thanks for dropping by the Snake Pit, where we thrive on untapped potential and lost opportunities. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell, like the video, and leave your opinions in the comments, where, naturally, I won't read them. Until next time, stay venomous.